It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Give me the keys to the estate office, Cassandra, Julian Vance snapped, his voice cutting through the hushed prayers of the funeral parlor. Cassandra Vance didn't look up from the casket. Her father's face looked waxen and unfamiliar beneath the heavy lid, a stark contrast to the vibrant, demanding man he had been only 4 days ago. The air in the room was thick with the cloying, sweet scent of over 200 white lilies, a fragrance that felt less like a tribute and more like a mask for the rot of the family dynamics currently on display. She felt a sharp poke against her shoulder. Julian was standing too close, his expensive cologne, something heavy with oud and arrogance, warring with the floral funeral arrangements. He looked impeccable in a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than the modest sedan she'd driven to the service. "Did you hear me?" he hissed, leaning down so his words were for her ears only. "I know Dad left the primary ledger in the office safe. I need it before the creditors start circling like the vultures they are. You've always been the quiet, obedient little bookkeeper. Don't start growing a spine today of all days." Cassandra finally turned her head. Her eyes were dry, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality. As a forensic auditor for one of the most ruthless firms in the country, she had spent a decade staring down corporate criminals who had stolen millions. Her brother, with his trembling hands and sweat-beaded upper lip, was an amateur by comparison. "This is a funeral, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, low vibration. "Have some respect." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh that drew the attention of a nearby group of mourners. Among them was Beatrice Sterling, the grand dame of the city's social elite, who watched the exchange with a narrowed, discerning gaze. Julian didn't seem to care. He thrived on the spectacle. "Respect! Respect doesn't pay the mounting interest on the Vance holdings," he sneered, loud enough for Beatrice to hear. He turned toward the older woman, his face instantly shifting into a mask of tragic burden. "You'll have to excuse my sister, Beatrice. Poor Cassandra has always struggled with the pressure of the family name. She's a bit overwhelmed. She doesn't quite understand the urgency of the business world. She spent too long hiding in her cubicle with her little spreadsheets." Beatrice offered a tight, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Loss affects everyone differently, Julian, though I must say your father always spoke of Cassandra's mind for details." Julian's jaw tightened. He reached out, his fingers digging into Cassandra's forearm with a bruising grip. "She has a mind for clerical work. I have the vision. Now the keys, I'm not asking again." The condensation on a nearby silver water pitcher dripped slowly, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of the droplets echoing the steady beat of Cassandra's heart. She looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. She could see the desperation behind his eyes. He wasn't just being a bully, he was drowning. "I don't have them on me," she lied smoothly. "Liar," he spat. He reached for her modest black clutch, his movements frantic. "Julian, stop," a new voice intervened. Eleanor Vance glided toward them, her black veil pushed back to reveal a face that had been expertly tucked and filled to defy her 60 years. She didn't look at the casket. She looked at Julian with a doting, worried intensity. "Don't upset yourself, darling. You know your blood pressure has been high since the expansion project hit that." Snag. She turned her gaze to Cassandra, and the warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, utilitarian sharpness. "Cassandra, dear, just give your brother what he wants. He's the one who has to carry the Vance legacy forward. You've always been self-sufficient. You don't need the estate the way he does. Don't be difficult. It's so unbecoming." "He's asking me to hand over the keys to the office before Dad is even in the ground, Mother," Cassandra said. Eleanor waved a manicured hand dismissively. "The world doesn't stop for the dead. Julian has a vision for the downtown development. He needs the paperwork to secure the final round of funding. You wouldn't understand the complexities of high-stakes finance. Now, be a good girl and help your brother." Cassandra felt the familiar weight of the sleeping lion persona she had worn for years. To them, she was the boring daughter, the one who worked a stable job and lived in a sensible apartment. They had no idea she was the primary shareholder, the very debt Julian was trying to outrun. Julian smirked, emboldened by their mother's support. He leaned in again, his breath hot against her cheek. "See, even Mother knows you're just a footnote in this family. Give me the office keys or I'll have the locks cut and tell the board you've been stealing from the petty cash. Who do you think they'll believe? The CEO or the mousy sister who can barely afford a designer handbag?" Cassandra reached into her purse. Julian's eyes lit up with predatory greed. She pulled out a small, leather-bound folder, not the keys, but a set of documents he had demanded she organize earlier that morning. "I found these in the study," she said, handing them over. Julian snatched them, flipping through the pages. He didn't notice the way Cassandra's eyes tracked his every movement. He didn't see her finger hover over the record button on the small device hidden in the fold of her mourning veil. "What is this?" Julian asked, his brow furrowing as he saw a name at the bottom of a transfer sheet. "Aegis Holdings. I didn't authorize this." "It was in Dad's private files," Cassandra said, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced him to lean in. "It looks like a tax lien, a big one, from a company that specializes in forensic recovery." Julian's face went pale for a fleeting second before his arrogance returned like a shield. "Nonsense. Dad was probably just looking into a competitor. This is why you're the auditor and I'm the boss, Cassie. You see a ghost and think it's a haunting. I see an opportunity." He tucked the folder under his arm and straightened his tie. "I'm taking the car. You can find your own way to the cemetery. And don't bother coming to the house for the wake. We're having a private meeting with the investors. People who actually matter." He turned on his heel, his polished Oxfords clicking sharply on the marble floor as he walked away, Elena trailing behind him like a loyal shadow. Cassandra stood alone by the casket. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't call a cab. She dialed a direct line that bypassed 3 receptionists and a junior partner. "Marcus," she said when the call connected. "It's Cassandra Vance. Julian just took the bait. He's headed to the office with the Aegis documents. He thinks they're a lead. He doesn't realize they're a confession." She paused, watching Beatrice Sterling watch her from across the room. Cassandra offered the socialite a slow, deliberate nod, the nod of an equal, not a subordinate. "Start the clock, Marcus," Cassandra said, her voice cold and certain. "I want the audit triggered by Monday morning. I'm tired of being the quiet one." The following Monday morning, the Vance family estate felt less like a home and more like a stage for a play Julian Vance hadn't realized was a tragedy. Cassandra sat at the mahogany dining table, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. The tea was cold, much like the atmosphere that had permeated the house since the funeral. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching the dust motes dancing over the heavy silver service, relics of a wealth Julian assumed was his birthright. Julian marched into the room, his polished Oxfords clicking sharply against the marble threshold. He looked entirely too energized for a man who had buried his father 48 hours prior. He wore a charcoal suit that Cassandra knew cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, his hair slicked back with the precision of a man who spent more time in front of a mirror than a ledger. He didn't look at her. He looked through her, his eyes fixed on the stack of mail by her elbow. "I need you out of the West Wing by Friday," he said, tossing a set of keys onto the table. They skidded across the wood, stopping inches from her hand. "I've officially moved the Aegis partnership forward. We're hosting a private launch gala here at the end of the week, and I need the guest suite for the lead investors." Cassandra didn't move. She felt the weight of the burner phone in her pocket, a secret anchor against his arrogance. "The West Wing has been my home for 5 years, Julian. It's where I stayed to take care of Dad while you were networking in the Hamptons. And you were compensated for your time," Julian snapped, leaning over the table until she could smell his expensive, woodsy aftershave. He tapped his heavy gold signet ring against the mahogany, a rhythmic, irritating sound. "But the charity ends now. This house needs to reflect the new direction of Vance Global. Having a dowdy forensic auditor lurking in the hallways doesn't exactly scream tech innovator." Elena Vance appeared in the doorway, her silk robe fluttering like the wings of a pale moth. She didn't look at the daughter who had spent the last 3 years paying the estate's property taxes through a discreet family trust. Instead, she moved straight to her son, smoothing the lapel of his jacket with a doting smile. "He's right, Cassandra," Alina said, her voice airy and dismissive. "Julian's vision is the family's future. We all have to make sacrifices for the greater good. You can find a nice, sensible apartment closer to your office. Somewhere functional." "Sacrifices," Cassandra repeated, her voice a calm, steady blade. She watched Julian smirk, the expression of a man who believed he'd already won. He didn't know that the Aegis documents he'd stolen from their father's desk weren't a secret offshore account. They were the forensic trail of his own embezzlement, a $3 million hole he'd dug while their father was too ill to check the books. Cassandra had spent months planting those leads, knowing Julian's greed would make him claim them as his own. Julian picked up a piece of toast, discarded it, and checked his reflection in the silver tea service. "Beatrice Sterling is attending on Friday. If this goes well, she's bringing the Sterling Foundation's endowment into the Aegis fold. I won't have you embarrassing me with your budget talk or your questions about the audit trail. You're dismissed." Cassandra stood slowly, her posture perfect. She caught her own reflection in the window, not the charity case Julian saw, but the woman who secretly held the deed to the very floor he was standing on. She had purchased the mortgage through a holding company 2 years ago when Julian's innovations nearly saw the house foreclosed. "Friday," she said, her voice devoid of the anger he expected. "I'll make sure everything is in order by then, Julian. You'll have exactly the gala you deserve." Julian laughed, a sharp, entitled sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. "That's the spirit. Glad to see you finally understand the hierarchy here." He turned to Alina, already discussing the catering, oblivious to the fact that the investors he'd invited had already been flagged by the SEC. Cassandra walked toward the hallway, her hand brushing the hidden envelope in her bag. Inside was the confirmation from Marcus Thorne. The audit hadn't just been triggered, it had been fast-tracked. As she reached the door, she paused, looking back at the two of them, the enabler and the thief, celebrating a victory built on a forged foundation. The countdown had begun. 4 days until the gala. 4 days until Julian Vance realized that the sister he'd dismissed as a pencil pusher was actually the one holding the eraser. 2 days later, the air in Marcus Thorne's inner sanctum felt significantly cooler than the suffocating humidity of the Vance estate. The office was a temple of mahogany and hushed voices, smelling of expensive stationery, and the bitter, dark roast of Marcus's espresso. Cassandra Vance sat across from him, her fingers tracing the edge of a thick manila folder. It was the weapon she had been waiting for, a meticulously compiled history of her brother's greed. Marcus leaned forward, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. He slid a single page across the desk. It wasn't a complex spreadsheet, but a simple list of wire transfers. "He's been bolder than we thought, Cassandra," Marcus said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "Julian didn't just skim from the operating costs. He's been forging your signature on personal loans to cover his losses in that crypto mining venture that collapsed last spring. He's used the family trust as collateral for 3 separate high-interest lines of credit." Cassandra looked at the dates. The most recent transfer had been made only yesterday, the exact amount needed to secure the floral arrangements and the premium open bar for the upcoming gala. She felt a cold, sharp clarity settle in her chest. Her brother wasn't just a thief. He was a parasite who had grown so comfortable in his host that he no longer feared the immune system. "And the SEC flags?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. "Detective Sarah Miller has already verified the offshore accounts," Marcus confirmed, tapping a pen against the desk. The rhythmic click-clack sounded like a ticking clock. "The moment Julian Vance stands on that stage and signs the final sponsorship agreement with the investors he's invited, he'll be certifying a fraudulent document. We won't even have to call the police. They'll already be in the room." Cassandra closed the folder. The weight of it was satisfying, a physical manifestation of the truth. "He thinks he's winning, Marcus. He thinks he's finally pushed me into a corner where I'll just keep paying to keep the family name clean. Let him think that for 48 more hours, Marcus replied with a thin, knowing smile. The more confident he is, the less likely he is to check the fine print on the documents you'll be handing him at the gala. The transition back to the Vance family offices an hour later felt like stepping into a lion's den, where the lion was too busy admiring its own mane to notice the cage being built. Cassandra had barely sat down at her desk when the door swung open, hitting the wall with a jarring thud. Julian Vance marched in, looking every bit the successful mogul in a tailored charcoal suit that Cassandra knew hadn't been paid for yet. Behind him trailed Eleanor Vance, her face set in that familiar expression of weary disappointment she reserved specifically for her daughter. "Why hasn't the transfer for Beatrice Sterling's auction item been cleared yet?" Julian demanded, slamming his palms onto Cassandra's desk. He didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in, his shadow falling over her, the scent of his expensive, musky cologne filling her space like an invasive species. "I told you, Cassandra, Beatrice is the key to the next round of funding. If we look cheap now, the whole house of cards." "Your house of cards, Julian," she corrected softly, not looking up from her monitor. "Our legacy," he snapped, his face reddening. He reached down and flicked the corner of her modest laptop. "While you're sitting here playing with your little spreadsheets and wearing shoes that look like they came from a discount bin, I'm out there building a future. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have the CFO of Vance Holdings looking like a librarian who lost her way?" Eleanor sighed, stepping forward to adjust Julian's lapel. "Cassandra, dear, please don't be difficult. Your brother is under a lot of pressure. This gala is his moment to shine. If you could just step back and let him handle the finances for once, everything would go so much smoother." The wait for it moment hung in the air, thick and heavy. Cassandra looked at her mother, the woman who had watched Julian steal Cassandra's inheritance and called it ambition. "You're right, Mother," Cassandra said, her voice a masterpiece of feigned submission. She opened a drawer and pulled out a single, gold-trimmed document. "In fact, I've already prepared the final authorization for the gala's primary sponsorship. It's all here. It just needs Julian's signature to go live." Julian's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam. He snatched the paper from her hand, his ego blinding him to the fact that his sister had never given in this easily in her entire life. "Finally. I knew you'd see reason once you realized I was the one holding the keys to this family's status." He didn't even read the clauses. He didn't see the addendum that linked the sponsorship to the forensic audit she had just finalized with Marcus. He saw only the dollar signs and the prestige of Beatrice Sterling's approval. "I'll sign this tonight," Julian declared, waving the paper like a trophy. "And Cassandra, try to find something to wear on Friday that doesn't scream disgruntled employee. It's a gala, not a funeral." He turned on his heel and swept out of the room, Eleanor following close behind, already whispering about the guest list. Cassandra sat in the sudden silence, the sound of their retreating footsteps echoing in the hallway. She reached into her bag and touched the hidden envelope containing the SEC's preliminary report. Julian was right about one thing. Friday would be a celebration. But as she looked at the countdown on her calendar, she knew it wasn't his victory they'd be toasting. 2 days. In 48 hours, Julian Vance would realize that the sister he dismissed as a pencil pusher hadn't just been keeping the books, she had been writing his ending. The day before the Sterling Gala, the air inside Marcello's boutique was thick with the scent of steam and imported wool. Cassandra Vance stood near the mahogany fitting platform, her expression unreadable as she watched her brother admire his reflection. Julian Vance smoothed the lapels of a midnight blue tuxedo, his posture radiating the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking. "Make sure the taper is aggressive," Julian commanded the tailor, barely glancing at the man kneeling at his feet. He turned his head, catching Cassandra's gaze in the three-way mirror. "And you, I hope you've sorted out that dress situation. Beatrice Sterling doesn't tolerate mediocrity, and I won't have you looking like a charity case while I'm finalizing the merger of the decade. Cassandra felt the familiar heat of a rage spike tighten her chest, but she channeled it into a slow, deliberate breath. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing the cold, embossed edge of the SEC report. The merger is contingent on a lot of factors, Julian. Perhaps you should spend less time on the upholstery and more on the audit trail. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He stepped off the platform, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. Audit trail? Cassandra, you've always had the soul of a clerk. You see rows of numbers, I see empires. While you've been busy playing with your little calculator, I've secured the Vance legacy. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper that made her skin crawl. Stay in your lane. Tomorrow night, you're just a guest in my house. Try not to embarrass me. The bell above the door chimed, and Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his sharp features illuminated by the afternoon sun. He carried a leather briefcase with the practiced ease of a man who held the keys to a kingdom. He offered a brief, professional nod to Julian before his eyes met Cassandra's. There was a flicker of shared understanding in that look, a secret power moment that Julian was too blinded by his own ego to perceive. The final documents are ready for the Sterling Group's review, Marcus said, his voice smooth and neutral. He tapped the briefcase. Everything is exactly where it needs to be for the reveal tomorrow. Julian beamed, clapping Marcus on the shoulder with a heavy hand. Excellent work, Marcus. I knew I could count on you to handle the heavy lifting while my sister worried about the pennies. I handle the details that matter, Marcus replied, his tone carrying a weight that Julian completely missed. As the tailor scurried back with a fresh shirt, Beatrice Sterling herself emerged from the private dressing suite at the back of the boutique. She was the personification of old money authority, her presence demanding immediate silence. Julian's demeanor shifted instantly, his arrogance morphing into a sycophantic grin as he hurried toward her. Mrs. Sterling, a pleasure as always, Julian gushed, reaching for her hand. Beatrice didn't offer it. Instead, her sharp, discerning eyes drifted past Julian, landing squarely on Cassandra. She watched the way Cassandra stood, not with the frantic energy of her brother, but with a terrifying, quiet stillness. Beatrice had spent 40 years identifying threats and allies. She saw the way Cassandra held herself, like a predator waiting for the wind to shift. You seem remarkably calm for a woman whose family business is on the precipice of such a significant change, Beatrice remarked, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. I find that the truth has a way of settling itself, Mrs. Sterling, Cassandra said, her voice steady and clear. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. I think we're all going to see exactly what the Vance name is worth. Julian scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Ignore her, Beatrice. She's always been prone to dramatics when she's out of her depth. Beatrice didn't look at Julian. She kept her eyes on Cassandra for a beat longer, a ghost of a smile touching her lips before she turned away. We shall see. Julian turned back to Cassandra, his face reddening with a second spike of irritation. Enough of your riddles. Go home, Cassandra, prepare yourself. It's the last night you'll spend as a silent partner in my shadow. By this time tomorrow, I'll be the most powerful man in this city, and you'll be lucky if I keep you on as a consultant. Cassandra didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply turned and walked toward the door, the rhythmic click of her heels sounding like a countdown. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she pulled her phone from her pocket. A message from Detective Sarah Miller sat on the screen. All systems go. The evidence is logged. See you at the gala. Cassandra looked up at the darkening sky. Julian thought he was preparing for a coronation. He had no idea he was dressing for a funeral. 24 hours remained. One more day of silence, and then the world would finally hear what she had to say. The evening of the Sterling Winter Gala arrived with a biting chill that did nothing to dampen the glittering chaos inside the grand ballroom. The air was thick with the cloying scent of forced lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Crystal chandeliers vibrated with the low hum of 500 elite voices, a sound that Cassandra Vance found remarkably similar to the buzzing of flies over a carcass. She stood at the edge of the mezzanine, her fingers grazing the cold marble railing. She wore a gown of midnight silk, simple, architectural, and far more expensive than anyone in her family would ever guess. It was the armor of a woman who no longer needed to hide, yet chose to for one final hour. Below her, Julian Vance was already in his element. He stood at the center of a circle of venture capitalists, his laughter ringing out with a practiced, hollow warmth. He looked every bit the visionary entrepreneur in his bespoke tuxedo, gesturing expansively as he sold a dream built on a foundation of stolen data and forged ledgers. "He looks like a king, doesn't he?" Cassandra didn't turn. She knew the perfume, heavy vintage Chanel. Eleanor Vance stepped up beside her daughter, her eyes fixed adoringly on her son. "He looks like a man who spent money he doesn't have on a suit he didn't earn," Cassandra said, her voice like a scalpel. Eleanor sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. "Must you always be so bitter, Cassandra? Tonight is Julian's coronation. Beatrice Sterling is here. The city's entire financial board is here. If you can't be happy for your brother, at least have the decency to stay out of his way. You're only here as his guest, remember." "I remember exactly why I'm here, Mother." A flash of movement caught Cassandra's eye. Across the room, near the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, Detective Sarah Miller stood in a plain navy dress, looking entirely out of place and perfectly positioned. She caught Cassandra's gaze and gave a single, imperceptible nod. The trap was set. The evidence Sarah had logged was now a digital ticking clock, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. Cassandra descended the stairs, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lethal beat against the stone. As she reached the floor, Julian spotted her. He didn't offer a smile, he offered a sneer. He broke away from his group, snagging 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and intercepting her before she could reach the main floor. "There she is," Julian said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby group of socialites. "My little shadow." "I'm surprised you found something to wear that didn't have ink stains on it, Cassie." The group chuckled. Julian leaned in closer, the smell of scotch and arrogance radiating off him. He shoved a glass toward her, his eyes dancing with a cruel light. "Do me a favor," he whispered, his tone dropping to a jagged edge. "Don't speak to Beatrice, don't speak to the press. Just stand there, look grateful, and try not to remind everyone that you're the one who spent the last 5 years counting my pennies while I built an empire." "An empire is a strong word for a house of cards, Julian," she replied, her expression unreadable. His jaw tightened, a vein pulsing in his temple, a classic rage spike he couldn't quite suppress. "You're jealous. It's pathetic. Tomorrow, when the merger is signed, I'll be the youngest chairman in the history of this district. And you'll be the sister of a titan, provided you learn to keep your mouth shut." He turned his back on her before she could respond, a calculated public dismissal. He marched toward the head table where Beatrice Sterling sat. Beatrice was the gatekeeper of the city's social and financial soul. Her approval was the final seal Julian needed. Cassandra watched him go, her pulse steady. She felt a presence at her elbow. Marcus Thorne appeared, his face a mask of professional neutrality. "The physical copies are in the media booth," Marcus murmured, pretending to check his watch. "The server override is scheduled for the 10-minute mark of his keynote. Are you certain about this, Cassandra? There is no coming back from what happens next." "I've spent a lifetime coming back from what he's done to me, Marcus," she said, her eyes fixed on Julian's retreating back. "Tonight, he's the one who runs out of road." Marcus nodded once and drifted away, disappearing into the crowd of tuxedoed men. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, and a spotlight cut through the gloom, landing squarely on the podium at the front of the room. A hush fell over the crowd. This was the moment the entire evening had been building toward, the announcement of the Vance Sterling partnership. Julian stepped onto the stage, the light reflecting off his polished shoes and his even more polished smile. He looked invincible. He looked like a man who owned the world. He adjusted the microphone, the feedback echoing slightly through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian began, his voice booming with a confidence that bordered on the divine. Tonight isn't just about a business deal. It's about a vision of a future where we don't just follow the market, we command it. From the front row, Alina beamed, her hands clasped to her chest. Beatrice Sterling watched with a hawk-like intensity, her chin resting on her hand. Cassandra moved slowly through the crowd, threading her way toward the tech riser at the back of the room. She passed Detective Miller, whose hand was already hovering near the radio at her belt. Julian was hitting his stride now, his rhetoric becoming more grandiose. They told me I couldn't do it. They said a man starting with nothing couldn't disrupt an entire industry. But I had something they didn't. I had the courage to take what I wanted. Cassandra reached the riser. She looked up at the giant screen behind Julian, which currently displayed a golden logo of his company. Her hand went to the small, encrypted remote in her evening bag. I want to thank the people who doubted me, Julian laughed, looking directly toward where he thought Cassandra was standing. Because your lack of faith was the fuel for my fire. You thought you could keep me small. You thought you could control the narrative. Cassandra's thumb found the button. She felt a strange, cold sense of peace. But the thing about narratives, Julian shouted over the rising applause, is that the winner is the one who gets to tell the story. He raised his glass to the room, his face flushed with the ultimate high of his own ego. He was seconds away from inviting Beatrice Sterling onto the stage to sign the papers that would finalize his fraud. And now, Julian cried, let's look at the numbers that made this all possible. He signaled to the tech booth. Cassandra pressed the button. The screen didn't show the projected growth charts. It didn't show the polished marketing slides. Instead, a grainy, high-definition video feed flickered to life, filling the 30-foot display. The room went deathly silent. Julian, still smiling, turned around to gesture at his success. The smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. On the screen, a younger, frantic Julian was caught in a hidden camera feed from 3 years ago, hunched over a desk, his voice clear and panicked through the ballroom's surround sound system. I don't care if the audit is coming, the recorded Julian snapped into a phone. Move the funds from Cassandra's personal trust into the offshore account. If she notices the discrepancy, I'll just tell her it was a tax adjustment. She's too stupid to check the forensic trail anyway. The ballroom became an ice box. Julian froze, his hand still raised in a toast, as the screen began to scroll through the actual bank ledgers, the ones Cassandra had spent 5 years reconstructively haunting. Julian turned back to the audience, his face the color of bleached bone. He looked for his mother, but Alina was staring at the screen in horror. He looked for Beatrice, but the socialite was already standing up, her expression one of frozen, aristocratic fury. Cassandra stepped out from the shadows of the tech riser, walking slowly down the center aisle. Every head turned. The mousy sister was gone. In her place was the woman who held the remote. Julian's microphone was still live. His heavy, ragged breathing filled the room, a rhythmic thumping of a heart realizing its own end. Julian, Cassandra said, her voice amplified and echoing, you were right about one thing. The winner does get to tell the story. She stopped 10 feet from the stage, looking up at her brother as the first of the police officers began to move in from the exits. And I'm just getting started. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt physical, a suffocating pressure that made the crystal chandeliers seem to vibrate. Cassandra walked toward the stage, her heels clicking against the polished wood with the steady, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. She didn't look at the audience. Her eyes were locked on her brother. Julian stood behind the podium, his hands gripping the edges so hard his knuckles had turned the color of bone. He tried to speak, but the only sound that came out was a dry, pathetic wheeze. She reached the tech riser and tapped a single key on the laptop. The massive screen behind Julian flickered, replacing his vision for the future slide with a stark, black-and-white spreadsheet. It wasn't a marketing graph. It was a forensic map of every cent he had ever stolen. This is the Vance legacy, she said, her voice amplified by the speakers until it shook the floorboards. 16 shell companies, 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and $4 million funneled directly from our mother's retirement fund into a failing crypto hedge fund registered in his name. The smell of ozone from the overworked projector drifted through the air, sharp and metallic. A collective gasp rippled through the room, starting at the front tables and surging toward the back like a wave. Julian finally found his voice, though it was thin and shrill. "It's a fabrication. She's bitter she's always been jealous of my success. Alina, tell them. Tell them she's lying." He turned toward the front row, but Alina Vance didn't move. She sat frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth as she stared at the screen. The realization was visible in the way her shoulders slumped, the facade of the proud mother shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Beside her, Beatrice Sterling stood up slowly. The socialite didn't say a word, but the look she directed at Julian was one of such profound, aristocratic disgust that it felt more damaging than a physical blow. She adjusted her silk wrap, turned her back on the stage, and began to walk toward the exit. It was the signal the rest of the room needed. The social elite began to drift away from the tables, physically distancing themselves from the stench of Julian's failure. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically dissolve. The arrogant tilt of his chin collapsed into a frantic, wet-eyed twitch. A single bead of sweat tracked through his expensive foundation, carving a jagged line down his cheek like a crack in a porcelain mask. His lips, usually so ready with a charming lie, peeled back from his teeth in a silent, animalistic grimace of pure terror. The vibrant, visionary glow he'd spent years cultivating vanished, replaced by a gray, sickly hue that made him look 20 years older. He looked like a man watching his own execution in high definition. His chest heaved, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow bursts that hissed through the live microphone. "The police are waiting in the foyer, Julian," Cassandra said, stepping onto the stage. She felt the cold weight of the USB drive in her pocket, the master key to his undoing. "Marcus Thorne has already filed the injunction to freeze every account associated with your name. You don't have a cent left. Not even the suit you're wearing belongs to you." Detective Sarah Miller stepped from the shadows of the exit, her badge glinting under the stage lights. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Julian had nowhere to go. Julian scrambled backward, tripping over the power cord. The projector cut out, plunging his face into a flickering, ghostly blue light. "You can't do this to me. I'm the face of this family. You're nothing without me." Cassandra stopped at the edge of the podium, looking down at him. She didn't feel rage anymore. She felt a clean, clinical detachment. "You said I was a parasite, Julian, that I lived off your light, but you forgot one thing about shadows." She leaned in, her voice a cold whisper that carried through the silent hall. "They only exist because the light is blocked. I'm moving out of the way now. Enjoy the dark." She turned and walked off the stage, her pace never faltering. Behind her, she heard the sharp, metallic snap of handcuffs and the first sob of a man who finally realized that his charisma was no match for the truth. She didn't look back. The doors were open, and for the first time in her life, the air outside felt perfectly clear. The echo of the handcuffs snapping shut was the only sound in the cavernous ballroom. It was a sharp, metallic finality that seemed to vibrate through the crystal flutes and the silk hangings. Julian Vance remained on his knees, his hands locked behind his back, staring at the darkened projector screen as if he could command the incriminating data to vanish by sheer force of will. The blue light from the dead machine cast long, distorted shadows across the marble, making him look like a ghost in his own house. Alina Vance broke the silence first. She rushed toward the center of the room, her heels clicking frantically against the floor. "Stop this! Sarah, tell them to stop!" She grabbed the arm of Detective Sarah Miller, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and social panic. "This is a family matter. Cassandra is just upset. She doesn't know what she's saying. Julian is the face of this company. He's the vision." The detective didn't move. She gently but firmly disengaged her arm from the older woman's grip, her expression professional and cold. "He's the face of a $3 million embezzlement scheme, Alina. There are no more family matters when the state is involved. The warrants are signed." Julian finally looked up, and the sight was enough to make the remaining guests recoil. The mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the sweat on his forehead glisten like oil under the ballroom's chandeliers. His eyes, usually bright with practiced charm, darted frantically, looking for an exit that didn't exist. His mouth hung open, a silent, trembling O that made him look less like a titan of industry and more like a landed fish gasping for air. The arrogance that had defined his posture for decades vanished, leaving his shoulders slumped and his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. There was a rhythmic, uncontrollable spasm in his left cheek, and every time he tried to swallow, his prominent Adam's apple bobbed convulsively against the high-collared shirt he'd bragged about earlier. He looked small, stripped of the borrowed light he'd used to blind everyone for so long. "Cassie," he croaked, the word barely a whisper. "Think about the legacy, think about Mom. You've had your fun, you've made your point. Now tell them it was a mistake. Tell them it was a simulation for the board. We can walk this back." Cassandra stopped near the heavy oak doors, her hand resting on the brass handle. She didn't turn around. The smell of stale lilies and expensive, wasted champagne felt heavy in her lungs, a cloying reminder of the life she was leaving behind. "The only mistake I made, Julian, was believing you were capable of feeling shame. You're destroying us," he shrieked, the panic finally breaking through his voice. He tried to lunge toward her, but the officers held him firm, the chains of the handcuffs rattling with his struggle. "You're a parasite. You're killing the Vance name for a grudge. You're nothing without this family." "The Vance name is fine," Marcus Thorne said, stepping forward from the shadows of the buffet table. He held a thick leather folder, the gold seal of the firm catching the light. "The company, the estate, and the intellectual property have been legally transferred back to the majority shareholder. As of 20 minutes ago, Julian, you don't even own the suit you're wearing. This house is no longer your residence." The room erupted into a low, frantic hum of whispers. Beatrice Sterling, who had been the centerpiece of Julian's social strategy for months, stepped forward. She looked down at him with a cold, clinical disgust that was more devastating than any shout. She didn't speak to him. She spoke to the room, her voice carrying with the weight of her social authority. "I believe I speak for the committee when I say that the Vance Foundation will be seeking a new chairman and a new venue. I find the air in here quite stifling." She turned her back on him, a deliberate public execution of his social standing. Alina turned to Cassandra, her eyes brimming with tears of indignation. "How could you do this to your brother? After everything I sacrificed to keep this family together, you've ruined his life." "You didn't keep us together, Mother," Cassandra said, her voice steady and devoid of the old, familiar hurt. "You just kept him fed. I'm done being the meal." She pulled the heavy doors open. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of rain and asphalt, a sharp, clean contrast to the cloying perfume of the ballroom. Behind her, she heard Julian's voice rise into a desperate, incoherent wail, the sound of a man realizing that his charm was a currency that had finally been devalued to zero. The witnesses were already moving away from him, forming a wide circle of avoidance as if his failure were contagious. Even the enablers who had laughed at his jokes an hour ago were now looking at their phones, erasing his number from their lives. Marcus caught her eye and gave a single, solemn nod. The trap was closed. The debt was called. The forensic trail she had spent months weaving had finally tightened into a noose. Cassandra stepped out onto the portico. The city lights stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. For years, she had lived in the periphery, a silent engine driving a machine that Julian claimed to own. Now the engine had stopped, and the machine had fallen apart. She didn't feel the rush of triumph she had expected. Instead, there was only a profound, quiet peace. She walked down the stone steps, her footsteps light and purposeful, leaving the wreckage of the Vance legacy behind her. She didn't need to see the end. She had already written it. 6 months had passed since the Vance legacy collapsed into a heap of forensic evidence and public shame. The dust had finally settled, but the landscape of Cassandra Vance's life was unrecognizably altered. She sat in the corner office of the newly rebranded Sterling Thorne Plaza, a space defined by floor-to-ceiling glass and the scent of expensive sandalwood. The air was pressurized, silent, and entirely hers. She wasn't an auditor hiding in the shadows anymore. She was the hand on the wheel. A sharp rap on the door broke her focus. Marcus Thorne entered, carrying a slim leather folder. He looked younger than he had during the trial, the weight of the legal battle replaced by the brisk energy of a man managing a thriving empire. He placed the folder on her desk with a rhythmic thud that echoed in the quiet room. "The final liquidation is complete," Marcus said, his voice holding a note of professional satisfaction. "The last of the creditors have been paid, and the remaining assets have been absorbed into your private holding company. It's officially over." Cassandra didn't reach for the papers immediately. She looked out at the city, watching the morning light catch the steel of the skyscrapers. "And the personal accounts?" "Drained," he replied. As per the court order, every cent Julian attempted to hide in the offshore shells was clawed back to cover the fraud penalties. He was vacated from the penthouse 4 months ago. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't a knock. It was a slow, hesitant push. Julian Vance stepped into the room, and for a moment, Cassandra almost didn't recognize him. The man who had once filled a room with his manufactured charisma looked diminished, as if the very air had been let out of his soul. His tailored Italian silk suits were gone, replaced by a generic off-the-rack blazer that hung loosely from his narrow shoulders. The cuffs were slightly frayed, and his shoes, once polished to a mirror shine, were scuffed at the toes. He didn't stride to the center of the office. He hovered near the door, his eyes darting toward the mahogany desk he used to claim was his birthright. The arrogance that had been his armor was gone, leaving behind a hollowed-out desperation that was far more honest than his charm had ever been. "I signed the papers," he said, his voice thin and raspy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled set of documents, handing them to Marcus without looking him in the eye. "The studio apartment in the East End. The rent is due on the 1st. I don't suppose the estate could." "The estate no longer exists, Julian," Cassandra interrupted, her voice as calm as the morning air. She finally turned her chair to face him. She didn't feel the surge of anger she had expected. There was no heat, only a profound, icy clarity. "You are responsible for your own expenses now. I believe the court suggested a vocational rehabilitation program." He flinched at the word vocational. He looked at her, searching for a flicker of the sister who used to bail him out, the sister who used to apologize for his mistakes. He found nothing but a stranger. "Mother won't see me," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "She won't even take my calls. She says the shame is too much for her to bear in the city." Cassandra felt a sharp, familiar pang in her chest. This was the cost. Eleanor Vance had fled to a small cottage in the countryside, refusing to acknowledge either of her children. She blamed Cassandra for the public exposure and Julian for the crime. The family unit hadn't just broken, it had been pulverized. Cassandra sent a monthly allowance to her mother, a gesture of duty that was never acknowledged with a thank you note, only a cold, monthly confirmation from a local bank. "Eleanor is choosing her own path," Cassandra said, her voice softening only slightly. "Just as you chose yours." Julian looked around the opulent office one last time. He saw the name on the door, his own name, but stripped of the prefix he had used to bully his way through life. He saw Beatrice Sterling's floral arrangement on the credenza, a sign of the social circle that had permanently barred its doors to him. He was a ghost in his own history. "I have nothing," he said, the realization finally landing with its full, crushing weight. "You have exactly what you earned," she replied. Marcus stepped forward, gesturing toward the door. The meeting was over. Julian lingered for a heartbeat, perhaps waiting for a final insult or a moment of gloating he could use to fuel a sense of victimhood. Cassandra gave him neither. She simply picked up her pen and began to sign the documents Marcus had brought. As the door clicked shut behind him, the silence returned to the office. It was a victory, absolute and legal. She had her wealth, her reputation, and the power to ensure the Vance name stood for something more than a con artist's playground. But as she looked at the empty chair across from her, Cassandra realized that justice, while satisfying, was a lonely companion. She had burnt the house down to get rid of the termites, and while the new structure was magnificent, the air inside was still cold. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew wouldn't be answered, listening to the dial tone of her mother's house until the line went dead. Then she went back to work.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.